Good afternoon, coming to you live from Radio City Music Hall, wherever you are. I am Rebecca Jones, and I'm the director of the Lead Institute, who's obviously been talking too much. Okay, who am I right now? Welcome back to the leadership and management track that has just been alive and thrilling for the last 2 days. And it's about to get even better, because get your dartboards out about how to make decision making. I am so delighted to have Scott Hargrove here, who's the director, CEO of Fraser Valley Regional Library System, which is one of the biggest in Canada, and one of the most complex, I would say, as well. And of course, MJ Delia, who is just my creative counterpart. He amazes me with his creativity and his way to deliver a message. He's the Associate University Librarian for University of British Columbia in Kelowna. And they are going to talk about decision-making. These two bring decision-making alive like you wouldn't believe. You will love decision-making. Sure. Okay. And I will turn it over to them.
Great. All right. So welcome, everyone. So glad you could be here. Yeah, I'm MJ. Happy to be presenting with Scott. We've had lots of great conversations in prepping for this session. You'll hear, I'm sure, some of that weave throughout our talk today. But, really, we all make decisions. The question that I sometimes have is, do we make them the right way? So this session is really to cover the range of decision-making approaches and thinking about how they might be used in our context. And we use the dartboard just because it's kind of a little more fun. And sometimes it does feel like you're throwing a dart, sometimes in the dark, about what we should do. And so I think today we've got an action-packed kind of 40 minutes or so, and hoping that we can definitely have some questions. And I'm just going to pass it over to Scott to set us up for what we're going to do.
Thank you, MJ. It's always a pleasure working with MJ. We have a lot of fun together, as we did for this one. So we divided the session into 4 10-minute chunks. The first is an introduction to the decision-making strategies we're going to talk about. Then we're going to look at some scenarios in the second 10-minute chunk. And then for the third 10-minute chunk, we're going to interview each other back and forth. That'll be lively. And then finally, allow you some chance to ask your own questions and to weigh in with your own thoughts. So we've got a fast move today. So we're going to about 40 minutes, as MJ said. So we're going to keep it moving. Let's go.
Right. So as Scott said, the first section here is starting with a basic introduction to different types of decision-making strategies. And just as a side note, if you're on the conference site, there's a full handout of what we're going to go through. So if you don't feel like you have to scribble everything down, grab that handout. It will be helpful. But let's jump in with our dartboard.
Fantastic. So our first set of the 4 different strategies we're going to be looking at, 4 broad strategies, are negotiated decisions. So these are mediated decisions, which are ones where you work through a third party. So basically, you've got a mediator who works with adversaries to reach an agreement. So a classic example of this would be mediation. If you've got 2 parties, say an employer and a union, who are unhappy about a particular interpretation of a collective agreement clause, they bring in a mediator to help them work out the issue. Then there's contractual. This is when you have 2 parties who are a little bit friendlier. They interact directly without a mediator, but they still end up with some sort of a binding or signed agreement. So think about an employment contract, for example. You've got an employer who's happy to be hiring somebody, an employee is very happy to be coming in, and they just have to make sure they both understand the terms of the arrangement. And then finally, you've got the informal negotiated decisions. So this is where no formal agreement is required. Partners discuss their desires and terms and move forward together. So of course, it generally involves a high degree of trust. Great example is when MJ and I were dividing the labor for this presentation. We both had a high degree of trust and comfort, not a problem. We worked through it very quickly and easily.
Yeah, we did a virtual handshake, I guess, on that one.
We did.
So the next group is executive decisions. These are the ones we're probably familiar with, but let's run through them anyway. First being the unilateral decision. The decision is made, orders are dictated, usually from the boss in the circumstance. So an example, usually in an emergency situation, or maybe there's a fire or fire alarm or something, and so someone has to be in charge and someone just has to make the decision. But a variable of that is the delegative decision, and that's really about delegating to an expert. So whoever's in authority recognizes they don't have all the facts or the expertise required for the decision. And so they allow someone else to sort of step up and make the call. You could think of like a cybersecurity incident where chances are the CEO or the leader doesn't have the background, unless you're Scott. And so someone else, you're going to pass it off to someone who understands that. And then the last group is the consultative approach where, you know, really you're asking for perspectives, but the boss is not handing over decision-making authority to the group. The boss is still saying, I want your feedback, I want your ideas, but really I'm going to make the final call. And you can think of lots of examples, I'm sure, in your organizations. You know, maybe you're running a marketing and communications plan. You want lots of ideas about how to do that, but ultimately you're going to decide the path forward.
The next step we have are rules-based decisions. And these are the easy ones, quote unquote, because you're following the rules, right? Not so much. Majority decisions are the first one, and that's deciding by the decision by a popular vote. Show of hands. Easiest way to, easy example is, hey, let's go to a restaurant tonight. Who votes for whatever restaurant? And the majority wins. Then you've also got minority, also referred to as a supermajority, which is one of the more complicated concepts to get. It's the same concept as majority vote, but the threshold for something to pass is much higher. For example, often a 2/3 majority in order to pass something. With such a high bar for passing something forward, it's often called a minority method because the minority actually holds more power in the equation than the majority. So a great example of this would be if you have a special motion in a board or committee meeting where it's not enough to just get half the group, you're looking for 2/3 of the group. That's when it really comes through as a best example. And then finally, you've got, you know, quote unquote, the easy rule-based decision, which is by the book. So that's when you're simply following the instructions or rules that were written before. Classic example is something like a software upgrade. It's not like you're deciding which parts of the software upgrade to do. You simply follow the steps, go through them all bit by bit, and you're done.
All right, and the last quadrant in our dartboard is the collaborative decisions, and you've probably all been part of these at various points in your careers or, you know, personal lives. But first being the consensual approach, where like you're taking the time to work together to build the buy-in, looking for some sort of win-win opportunity, and the goal, of course, is seeking as much agreement or consensus as possible. And so some organizations do strategic planning like this initially, where they're trying to get everyone on the same page to understand and provide feedback and really build buy-in to what the organization's trying to do. The second approach in this quadrant is collegial, which really it's about exploring all the different perspectives that are at play in the decision and looking for common ground. And so sometimes you see partners do this, or different teams within an organization start talking together, working together, trying to synthesize their ideas of what they want to do and bring those together and sort of form a new proposal for funding, right? Lots of libraries do this within the organization, but also with partner organizations, trying to be collegial, trying to get a direction moving forward and putting an idea together that benefits both groups. And then the last is a dialogic approach, which is probably more like a debate, where instead of me bringing my idea and perspectives and defending that idea, I bring my idea and you bring your idea, and then we step back from our personal take and we really evaluate and debate the pros and cons and question our assumptions and try to get to a better understanding through a rigorous process, right? So in some cases, when, like, let's say you have a workplace accident, there's usually a form to fill out, but there's a lot of different takes on why that accident happened or what, right? So you want to actually really understand the situation by having a bit of a debate.
Now we're going to look at the scenarios. We're forging ahead right on time, which is excellent. These are all the basic categories of decisions we've looked at. Now we're going to try and see them in action. So we're going to introduce 4 different scenarios. Some of them are deeply personal because they've happened to us, and then offer 2 different takes on which decision-making strategies might work best in each scenario. And we've had a little bit of fun with this because not all decision-making strategies are necessarily going to be appropriate. So I think that in this one, I hope I got this right. MJ will be the orange dot on most of these, and I'll be the yellow dot, I believe. It may switch up a little bit though. So have a look.
All right, so our first scenario is a pipe has burst unexpectedly in the library. The library is flooding, and Scott's going to tell you the best approach for him.
So when this happened to me for the first time on Christmas Day last year, and then for the second time on, Christmas Eve, and then Christmas Day, 2 different libraries, 2 different floods, I can tell you that I immediately employed the unilateral delegative decision making methodology. So it was an emergency situation, and I immediately started giving orders, as in we had to immediately notify the municipality to get the facilities people in to fix it. And this is where I practice some delegating, because I'm not a plumber. And I certainly don't know the first thing about actually repairing said pipe. All I know is I need to find somebody to do it quick and start preserving books. So that's the unilateral delegative.
And to have a bit of fun with these scenarios, we picked ones that maybe were a little bit different. So I'm going to propose to you that, yeah, Scott's approach is direct and it takes control. But what if you took a consensual or collegial approach to this flood in the library, and you just brought everyone together to discuss the situation, share their perspectives, agree together on a course of action, sort of form a committee. I want full agreement from the group about what we should do. Obviously, that's a decision-making method that works, but not as quickly as what Scott has said. Let's go to our second scenario.
Our second scenario is your organization is looking at working with a new partner. So for example, you're in the community and you think, oh man, that organization is very much aligned with our strategic goals. We could partner together and get this major thing done together, working together.
So my approach in this case is starting with an informal approach. So my strategy, and this is just my preference, I think, as a leader and a style, is just let's explore together with the partners and see what we want to accomplish first. So, but usually if it's a real partnership, you can't just do a handshake deal between 2 leaders, because there are obviously logistics and things that will fall out. So once I have a sense though of what we need and what we want to do together, then I think we start working together on a bit of a document or something that would codify our relationship and how that partnership should play out.
Okay, I was just starting to fall asleep a little bit there. That's just not what I would call the appropriate thing. That takes so long. I obviously know better. I run an amazing library system. I know our community is far better than that stupid community partner. I'm just going to dictate terms to the partner, and that'll make things go a lot faster. That would just take way too long.
All right, our third scenario. So, and this has happened in various jurisdictions all over North America, but the accessibility laws changed. And so we need to make adjustments to the website to satisfy what the government says is expected of us in our sort of digital presence. So Scott's going to go first.
Well, I really have to say in this case, using the dialogic solution, does the government really know best in this case? I have to wonder about that. This seems like a crazy decision to make. We need to explore all of the other options out there. This seems very prescriptive. What are other jurisdictions doing? Do we even have people in our area who are colorblind? I have to wonder about that.
So another approach might be to do the by the book. This is really a compliance issue when the government changes laws and expectations, and usually gives you a runway to become compliant. Then the government has set the standards and they've set the timeline, and we need to meet them. So it's not really like we can negotiate, as Scott has suggested, that maybe the government doesn't know what they're doing. In this case, we have to follow it. So there's not a lot of debate required here. I think we just need to put our team on it, follow the book, and make it happen.
So in the end, of course, all of us in our careers at some point will face that very unhappy situation where your funders say to you, we have a problem in the funding levels, you're going to have to make some cuts to your budget, to your staffing, to whatever approach you've got to take to bring your bottom line down to a lower level. So whenever we're looking at this, it's a nightmare scenario, involves a lot of decision making. MJ, your solution.
So, honestly, my solution, when you have to restructure an organization, it affects everybody. So I'm going to say that we're going to give everyone a say and go with sort of a majority vote approach to every decision we have to make. I know that people will obviously act in the best interests of the organization. So we'll just begin every day with a vote and a ballot. We'll know by the end of the day which decisions we're going to make. We'll be fine. We got to trust our people.
Which is certainly one approach to this particular nightmare scenario. However, this situation is one of the strange ones because it's so involved, you can't just use one method. You need to gather your options, and the best people to ask are some of your trusted leaders. So you will work with a group of people who are going to help you make those hard decisions. There will guaranteed be a lot of collegial or dialogic conversations in those type of meetings as you start to prepare your strategy for how to manage this. Any restructuring is going to bump up against things like employment agreements and potentially union contracts. So you can expect some contractual negotiated decisions that are heavily informed by documents that you are bound by. And then lastly, well, I guarantee you want to consult widely. As the CEO, if I'm facing these sort of situations, I'm going to retain my right to make the final decisions because it's the future of the business. I'm accountable for the business as a whole. And in the end, the funders are going to be looking to me as the person who's responsible for those decisions, not the collective group of people who report to me.
So obviously we were having a little bit of fun with those scenarios and picking extreme examples in part to demonstrate that how you choose to make that decision can sometimes really impact what happens, number one, and then the after effects or how people feel about those decisions. So we only went through 4 scenarios. If you download the slide deck on the conference website, you'll see I've got, I don't know, maybe another 4 at the end of the deck if you're curious about other ways or other scenarios that you might want to play around with. As we were planning this session, though, we had a couple of really interesting conversations, and we were trying to figure out the best way to capture that from a leader's perspective, right? We've just talked about the types of decisions, and then we've had some fun with applying them. But obviously, we're all individuals. We all have different approaches. And so we thought what we would do is ask each other a few questions to get you all thinking. And maybe then you can pepper some questions in towards the end. But I'm going to start with the first one and just ask you, Scott, when you look at yourself as a leader, you're obviously, as Rebecca said from the outset, part of a complicated organization that spans quite a big geography in British Columbia. You've been a leader for a long time. So what is your preferred decision-making style? And maybe the flip side as well, like the least favorite?
Thanks, MJ. For sure, it's a strange one. So I'd love to be able to say that my preferred decision-making style is absolutely the best one all the time, or even the best one for the situation. But the reality is, like everybody, I have my own personal style, my own personal leadership style, and that informs my decision-making style and my preferences thereof. So my preferred ones are collaborative. Why? Well, especially the consensual and the collegial ones, because in part, they're employed when you have a nice, meaty issue to sort out. And generally, you have the time to make a good, informed decision with that. You're not looking at an emergent situation, so it's hard to look at a pipe burst, for example, as being a nice, exciting decision-making opportunity to engage in. I love ones where I can bring my team together, collaborate with everybody, really have a great discussion, and in the end, you get a better decision out of it. So I can go back to my board with confidence and say, hey, I've done this, this is why I've done it. And here are all the people and the reasons who back me on why this is a good decision. That fills me as a leader with a lot of comfort. I'm not taking a chance. I'm not rolling the dice. And even if that decision goes wrong, I can say to the people I'm accountable to, hey, these are all the things that I've done to make sure that this is the best decision possible. Sorry, it didn't work out. Can't be perfect all the time. Here's what I'm going to do to fix it. Makes it nice and easy. My least favorite, as I already alluded to, is in the executive realm, especially unilateral, because they generally mean there's no time to seek information, or a tremendous conflict has to be resolved by a dictate from the boss. And the type of person that I am, I prefer not to be in a position to dictate terms. I have, and I can, that's absolutely the case, but in the end, it's not my preferred comfort area, and it's when I lose sleep at night over it. But the situation is really a situational basis, because usually the situations which call for those type of decisions are usually not pleasant ones. They usually involve conflict. They usually involve emergencies, and those are never good times in life. We've had enough of those in the last few years to reflect back on. But when you're in charge, you have to anyway, because consultation usually results in better decisions. But on occasion, you just have to make the call. All right, question 2. So, MJ, how has your approach to decision-making changed over time? And you have been a leader for a long time as well. I'm sure it's changed a lot.
Yeah, this one I remember we had a great conversation about. So I think my path is probably similar. I'm going to make an assumption here that those of you who are in leadership roles, when you think about when you first took over, I was maybe frustrated by the previous leader's style, I'll say, or something like that. So I was like, we're going to do everything as a team. We're going to be transparent. I want to hear all the voices. I want to make sure everyone feels heard, and so that's how I approached it at the very beginning of my sort of management. And I quickly learned, number one, your team won't always agree on everything, so you still need a way to resolve that. Number two, they don't want to know everything. That's why you're in the position you're in. They want you to make some of those decisions. And so it's not that they don't want to be consulted, but they don't necessarily need to be involved in every part of the decision. So I remember distinctly, like, one of my team members pulled me aside and was just sort of like, hey, you're the one who's supposed to make the call. Like, we can all advise, but you're in the role to make the call. And that was sort of a wake-up call for me to realize, like, I wasn't playing the role or taking the responsibility that I needed to for decision making, because I was trying to make sure everyone was going to be happy, if you want to simplify it. And of course, we all know they aren't always happy. There is no path where they're all happy. And so I think that was one thing. I think the other thing, my tendency, which is more about communication style, is, and this may be true for many of you who are listening, I would delay communicating a decision that I knew wouldn't be received very well, right? So I had some bad news or something, and so I would delay and just, I think I've come as I've matured. I hope I've matured as a manager, and sort of said, Brene Brown has this famous line that's like, clear is kind. And I would say clear is kind, and clear and quickly is important too, that you don't leave too much time when you've got bad news to deliver. You don't sit on it, that you actually sort of move forward to let people know, so that they can start their process of sorting out what it means for them, right? That's actually the kindest thing to do. And I was probably just mostly conflict averse early on, figuring like, the raging imposter syndrome and everything else that comes with your first time manager kind of position. And I was thinking, you know what, actually, this is better if I communicate that bad news. It's better if I take the role of making some of these decisions and explaining the rationale. And so I would say, like, that's the projection. Like you in your first answer, I prefer to bring the team in, because I don't know everything. And I think the team's perspectives are really valuable. When you can build that trust and work with that team, then that's the perfect kind of style for me as well. Just really opening it up to the group and their expertise.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to do the third one here, because I think you mentioned it a little bit in your first answer, and maybe you can unpack it a bit, because when we were first planning this session, it was a lot about, like, are we talking about leadership? Are we talking about decision making? And they're obviously intertwined. And so I'm curious, in your mind, how do decision making strategies, some of the things we played with in the dartboard, relate to like a leadership style, and maybe your own, maybe what you've seen in the industry? You've been around for a while, so keep it open-ended for you.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, MJ. Yeah. And I would be the first to agree, going back to yours for a second, that ripping off the Band-Aid is a term for a reason. There's times when you want to just make a decision and move forward. Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. When you look at leadership styles, they are absolutely going to be a good indicator of your preference in decision-making styles. It's not just leadership styles. Your actual, if you look at your Myers-Briggs profile, your insights profile, your DISC profile, any of those are also going to be instructive to you from a self-awareness perspective on where your own preference lies for decision-making styles. So, for example, in my case, if I'm looking at Goldman's emotional intelligence leadership styles, a leader with a preference for a democratic style is more likely to favor a collaborative approach, particularly consensual decision making. So you look at the fact that, okay, great, you've just heard both of us in that aspect. We have our preferences, right? We like to be in a consensual place. We like to have the support of our team. I'm absolutely like that. I have a great team of people I worked with for a long time. They've all stuck with me for several years, way longer than most teams do. And there's nothing I like better than when I can work with them together collaboratively to produce a very strong, powerful decision-making product. That's a great thing. So that is absolutely my preference. The danger always is that, of course, you follow your leadership style preference, your personal preference, and choose a decision-making strategy which is not appropriate to the tool. So the example I usually give in this case is that, well, I need a Robertson screw for my screwdriver to put in this Robertson screw, but I really love this sledgehammer, so I can use that. It'll put the screw in, no problem. Unfortunately, it may also cause you other issues in some areas because it's not an appropriate tool for the job. In the end, if you've broken the 2x4, you're trying to screw down to the foundation, that's not going to work out well. So throughout the entire pandemic for me, it was very challenging. We were hitting health scenarios on a regular basis where we had new health regulations coming in, often with only hours to actually implement them. And it involved me just giving unilateral decision after unilateral decision. The best I would be able to hopefully do is consult with our legal counsel to see if I interpreted something correctly, but otherwise I had to issue edict after edict, order after order. That's not my comfort zone. It was very stressful. It wore me down. It was rough. I much prefer that kind of a collaborative approach where I have a team I can work with and make a good decision. So MJ, I think we've covered a lot of these areas, so I'll let you, this is a perfect place to expand on it. Is it possible, do you think, to teach others how to improve their decision-making habits in line with this model, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. This is a conference session after all, and many of you may be here in part just because you're curious and hopefully are learning some things about decision making. Like any topic you want to teach, I think the people learning have to be somewhat humble and teachable, because if you go into this thinking, well, I'm the boss, so I make the decision how I make the decision and everyone has to accept it, you run the risk of, eroding the trust of the team that you've set up. And, there's some downstream effects, as you even alluded to, right? With your team. I think though, when you're trying to learn about decision-making, one of the things for me that helped is separating the decision from the outcome. So we have this tendency to assume a decision was good because the outcome was good. And a lot of the times though, we don't focus on how the decision was made. We just look at the data or the result, or so it must have been the right way to make the decision, or it must have been the right decision because the outcome was right. And I think if you really want to learn about decision making, you have to go before the outcome and focus on process, because that's that saying that hindsight's 20/20. Well, like at the time when you made that decision, you didn't have all the information, and you never will have all the information. And so I think there's a part where you have to realize and give yourself grace when you're looking back historically and say, you know what, when I was facing that circumstance, I didn't know these other factors, or I didn't know what would happen. And so you have to sort of accept the fact that you don't have all the information. As a result, you focus more on how am I going to tackle this decision, right? Do I bring the right people? Did I miss someone that should have been included, a perspective that was really important? To me, that's where the learning is. Sure, the outcome's important because you don't want to sink your organization, but I don't think we should be judging our decision-making approaches based solely on whether, we got the funding or not, or, whatever the outcome is. So I think that to me is like, it's that subtle difference between getting too outcome focused and really starting with the understanding the process itself. Anyway, hopefully that sparks a few thoughts. I'm going to throw the last one in. We had this as maybe if we have time permitting, but I think it's so rich. And it's really like that. What's the relationship between decision-making and conflict? Because someone has to decide. And as we've already said, you're not going to make everyone happy. So Scott, you had some thoughts.
Absolutely. Decision-making has the ability to both initiate and end conflict, which is the strangest thing about it. It does both of those things. It can be highly effective in doing both of those things. Ultimately, it's designed to make conflict productive rather than destructive. That's really what the goal is in the end. Collective bargaining, for example, you're bargaining with your union, you're determining your employment contract or changes to it. It inevitably has conflict embedded in it, but the conflict is productive, hopefully, and the process itself is designed to support the effective production of a solution, and preferably a long-lasting solution. In that specific agreement area, I always look at the fact that the best decision you can have results in both parties having, being happy, right? That's the best possible agreement you can have. Both sides are happy. But the second best possible agreement you can have is when both sides are equally unhappy. You run into trouble when somebody's happy and somebody's unhappy. That produces a long-term damage to a relationship. You want to have a compromise is a very powerful tool. Decision-making strategies are often designed to extract a compromise between two different courses of action, two different parties who might not agree with one another. So in the end, that collective agreement, for example, when you look at collective bargaining, fresh in my mind because we're right in the middle of that with our union right now, It articulates how both sides, management and staff, agree to interact in the workplace. But interestingly, if there's a problem with that, if if there's a difference of opinion on the interpretation of a clause in your collective agreement, well, guess what? You're right back in decision making again. You bring in a mediator, an arbitrator. You start trying to determine what you can live with in the end and what that solution is going to be. So it's an interesting duality of it. Is that when you look at decision making, it ultimately is designed to both manage a conflict and to produce an effective result at the end, rather than damaging conflict in the long run.
Yeah, I wonder if I might add a little bit, because I think collective bargaining is a very structured decision-making process. But in my experience, the conflict can happen at a team level too. So you make a decision, there's a conflict, and then as a team leader, you have to figure out, like, is the concern about the course of action we agreed to, right? They either can't buy in or they don't agree, and so there's that. Or is it they weren't consulted, right? So was it a process problem? So it's like, again, to me, it's that conflict around the way we went about deciding and then what we decided, and teasing that apart for folks so that, number one, you can figure out what your team needs to do together to improve the process side. And if there's fundamental differences on the strategy or direction, that's going to continue to be a problem until it gets resolved. And so, like you said, back to the decision making, back to the conversation, back to the conflict management. So I think there's that component as well. Both big and small conflict happens when leaders have to take a stand somewhere. Okay, so Scott's going to introduce the next section here.
Oh, we want to look to you now for questions. So hopefully you saw Rebecca's tweet and you are thinking of all the millions of questions that our various amusing scenarios and deep discussion have produced. So we want to know what you think. As you're getting ready to ask your questions, I do want to just do a quick review of exactly what we've covered. So we talked about 4 categories of decisions. We talked about rule-based, negotiated, collaborative, and executive. And of course, as MJ said, there's a lovely cheat sheet available for download from the conference website. We applied those decision-making strategies to various scenarios to demonstrate that each of those strategies have both strengths and weaknesses. And when you best use them is entirely context dependent in most cases. And then lastly, we shared some of our own perspectives on decision-making during our time as leaders. Those are opinions, but they're from people who have had a lot of experience in making a lot of decisions. And I'm looking at MJ, but I've had some decisions I've made that have not worked out well. So you learn from those too, no question. So what are you thinking? What are your questions? Thank you for listening to us today.
Oh, well, we couldn't not listen. This is really, really well done. And so when I put my question in the chat in feed loop, we have several people who responded, which is thank you very much. And most of them are ideally want to use a collaborative approach. Now they do balance that by saying it truly depends on the scenario. And I think that's interesting that, that is the go-to position is collaborative consensus. And Amanda Sweet asks a great question, which is, how do you change up a team or run interference when you have passed that point of no return for team dysfunction or incompatible personalities? This is where you talk.
Okay, I'll talk. Excellent, fantastic. I'm looking at MJ going, which of us is going to go first on this one?
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, I think the question almost includes part of the solution is you change up the structure of the team. It's certainly one of the options. When you've got a dysfunctional team, if it's possible to change it up, that's probably one of the best things you can do. I'm going to say that playing the sleight of hand approach is also not a bad thing. Decide that you're going to end that team and start a new one that is more appropriate to the challenge that you're currently facing. Just make sure you've got an option to pick some different people for that team is never a bad approach as well. In some cases, if the team is really dysfunctional, you can take an approach of bringing in an executive level of decision making and saying, this is the decision we're going to do. Help me implement it, which it's more prescriptive and certainly indicates to the team, you've got some work to do. Now I've given you less room to maneuver. But you still have an opportunity to work with me to make a good decision. MJ?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like step one is if you can fix the dysfunction or adjust the team is kind of where you have to go, because every decision after that is going to be filtered through a dysfunctional set of relationships, right? Now, in an academic context, it's not always easy, at least in my context, to just change the team up. And so I think the other thing a team leader may have to do is a lot of like pre-work before leading to a decision, right? A lot of checking in with folks, trying to figure out where they stand. It's a little bit of like sort of vote gathering, if you will, but like checking in to see where the support is and what the actual issues are, because when you bring a team together, not everyone feels comfortable to voice it in that context, but they might in one-on-one. And so I think there's a component where knowing the dysfunction is the first thing. And if you know that going in, then really trying to understand it if you can't change the team. The other part that Scott said is like, sometimes you do have to do an executive decision and use your position in the organization or invite someone who has a higher position to make a stance, clear rationale, and a new start. And I think that can be hard. It can be hard for organizations who aren't used to that kind of approach, but desperate times call for desperate measures sometimes. And I think, for the good of the organization is really what the leader has to think about. Because dysfunctional teams you can lose really key players who get tired of the dysfunction not being addressed, and then they just go to another organization. And who stays? The dysfunctional ones, ultimately.
I might just throw in one other thing that crosses my mind, which is, of course, third-party mediation, if it's a critical enough issue, is the other thing that can be very workable. This happens most commonly in labor relations context, but sometimes having that third party come in, you lose a bit of control, but it can help to address the sort of the functioning of the team in the long term. If you have people on the team you simply can't do without.
I have questions for you then. So how do you recommend for capabilities and confidence in decision making to be developed throughout your organizations? Because one of the challenges that when I talk with senior leaders, particularly in public libraries, is they go into a new situation and suddenly everybody's just looking to them for decisions. And so to spread that equitably through the organization, so the decision is made where it's supposed to be. Perhaps the accountability for it is elsewhere, but to grow that capability. Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, because I actually think libraries that I've seen set this up incorrectly, where the decisions end up always funneling to the top and people like sort of stepping back from responsibility. And so that situation that you described then puts the leader in a position where like they're frustrated because they're making a bunch of decisions that probably aren't appropriate for their role. But I think a strong leader then at the top of the organization has to say, we're moving the decision-making to down through the organization to where it's more appropriate, which also means you have to be okay when the wrong decision gets made. And that's where we fall down, because we're like, oh, that was a bad decision. It didn't turn out the right way. And then that trickles through the organization, communicating that we don't trust anyone else to make decisions. So then what do people do? They start kicking it back up to the top. So I think there has to be an element where we are like telegraphing that we want to push decision-making to the level that's appropriate, that we support it, and that we have the right sort of debriefing or postmortem after decisions, because things always go wrong, like not every time, but when we run into those issues, how do we then learn from it? So the focus is on the learning, not on like blame. And if you can do that, then you can start to build trust, and then people start feeling like my organization believes that I can do this, right? And if you think about it, most people who work for us, work in our organizations, somehow figured out how to buy a car and a house and like other major life decisions. Feels like they could probably make some decisions in their organization as well. So, Scott.
I'll throw in the fact, so everything MJ said, definitely. I'm going to throw in the situation just for a moment in time at my organization. So of course, throughout the pandemic, we had to centralize a lot of decisions with the executive team and with the CEO, myself. what we're trying to do now is we're consciously trying to push some of that decision making back, because let's be honest, a lot of people are like, great, I don't have to make decisions anymore. Awesome, right? And they're quite happy to push up those decisions. And now we're trying to push things back down. And as you said, MJ, it requires a lot of trust. An aphorism I've said for years is, it always amazes me as a leader what people will do without asking permission and what they won't do without asking for permission. And they are not necessarily what you would hope for or expect. And whenever I'm looking at people in the organization, it's building a degree of trust so that they can feel comfortable with exactly what MJ said, that they can make the decision, and that if it goes wrong, they aren't going to be hung out to dry for it, right? It's building that degree of trust. It's involved, a certain amount of it is coaching, is training in exactly what we're training on today, decision-making agreement. But it's that trust is a key component of it.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm not being fair here. We have a few minutes. Last question. How do you avoid micromanaging but still maintain a healthy amount of involvement to make good decisions?
I'll leap in on that one to start. All right, yeah. So you have to categorize your decisions as to which ones are you going to micromanage because you have to micromanage them because you are accountable for them. They have a high degree of complexity, of a high degree of risk if they are made wrong, for example, versus ones that, as MJ was saying earlier, ones that if they go wrong, well, it's unfortunate, but it's not the end of the world kind of thing, right? So I think it's partly assessing the level of risk of the question and the level of consequence if the decision goes wrong.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a bit of like, what's the high stakes decision?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's maybe a path it's almost like a mentorship scenario where, like, okay, you're working with someone, here's how I went about making that decision last year. Let's make it together this year. Let me watch you make it the third year. And then the fourth year, I know you're fine, right? Like there's sort of this path of helping people with those bigger decisions. And I mean, micromanaging is a reality. I sometimes think, like, if you've got time to micromanage, then maybe you don't have enough on your plate. So maybe you should take on a project so that you don't have time to micromanage someone else.
Great.
Good joke.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Everybody's saying thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I couldn't agree more. And I encourage everyone to grab those PowerPoints and handouts. And of course, the recording will be made available about November 1st in there. There's a lot of work for Steve and Bill and the technical crew to do. But thank you so much, Scott. Thank you so much, MJ. I welcome everyone to come and participate in a case study, not to hear a case study, but to do the case study. And we will start that again in 15 minutes. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Everyone.
Thanks all.